Reading.
Um, Hi, I am Emily Selove. I'm a senior lecturer in medieval Arabic literature, and I'm here to interview my colleague, Sajjad Rizvi, who is Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History, and we're both at the University of Exeter. And I want to ask him a little bit about an article he wrote called, what's it called, Sajjad? I forgot to look. Oh, This So Solid Flesh, Islamic Approaches to Human Pleasure. Hello, welcome, Sajjad.
Hi, thanks, Emily.
So yeah, can you first just say a little bit about why you wrote this article and the volume that it appeared in, which is called Pleasure, a History, and includes several other essays by other people?
So there's kind of a longer trajectory of this. I met the editor, Lisa Shapiro, at a conference on selfhood and subjectivity, probably about 10 years or so ago. And we stayed in touch. And then she told me that she was doing this volume on pleasure, which was going to be, part of this new series. Oxford Philosophical Concepts was a series which was being commissioned around 8 to 10 years ago. And she was doing a volume on pleasure, and she wanted it to be about intellectual pleasures and looking at how different traditions, different historical periods looked at the question of pleasure. And since she knew that I worked on Islamic thought, she asked me if I would basically do the Islam chapter. As you can imagine, these sorts of books, you're lucky if you have one Islam chapter. So I basically did the Islam chapter. That's the whole series basically runs like that. So the one on health has an Islam chapter, and the one on eternity has an Islam chapter, etc. So that was the remit. And then we had this kind of very strange workshop on it at Simon Fraser, which is where Lisa is a professor. And since it's such a long way away, I actually was online in that conference way before that became the norm. And so I remember, I think I gave my paper at something like 1 o'clock in the morning because of the 8-hour time difference. So yes, that's how I kind of got asked to do it. But also I messed a bit with the remit. So the remit was very much to focus on the intellectual pleasures. And as we know in the Islamic philosophical traditions, the likes of Abu Bakr Razi, Farabi, Avicenna, etc., for them, there's a fairly dualistic conception of the human. So the human is made up of a body and a soul. And of course, the intellect, the cognitive faculties relate to the soul. Identity resides in the soul. And the features which are of the body are considered to be transient and fleeting, whereas those that pertain to the soul are permanent and eternal. And so when it comes to things like pleasures and pain, the argument is that you need to be cultivating intellectual pleasures and foregoing intellectual pains. And things like ignorance are intellectual pains, of course. And not worry too much about the bodily pleasures and pains, right? So that was kind of the background, the basis for it. But what I wanted to do was to say, well, actually, if we consider, if we look at this question of what philosophy is in the Islamic traditions, in a broader sense, so if we bring in some Sufi texts, if we bring in kind of philosophical readings of hadith literature, and other kinds of literature, even kind of sexology, which we could consider, then you get a far more holistic concept of what the human is, which means that when you start talking about things like pleasure, you cannot avoid talking about bodily pleasures as well. And then have a slightly more kind of nuanced discussion of how bodily pleasures relate to spiritual pleasures.
Right. And does that holistic worldview tie in with the sort of monotheistic reaction against dualistic models where, body versus soul,
Right.
good versus evil?
So that's a good question. I mean, certainly on the whole, in terms of the philosophical tradition, that sort of association is not usually made. Mainly because most of the philosophers had strong Neoplatonic sympathies. So for them, the body really was just this kind of vehicle of the soul, which it attached to in the world of generation and corruption, right? Mm-hmm. So of course, some philosophers thought that souls existed prior to the body. Most of them did not think that they did. So some of the more Platonic philosophers, some of the Ismaili philosophers, for example, in the early period thought that. But certainly they weren't really concerned about what happens to the body after the death of the body.
I see.
And that, of course, led to all these kind of debates about resurrection, and the philosophers supposedly, being unbelievers because they rejected bodily resurrection. Mm-hmm. One of the famous 3 charges that Ghazali makes against Avicenna and the philosophers is that they deny this, what he considers to be a Quranic doctrine.
I see.
Right? So that's there. But of course, what I was trying to show is that it's not just the kind of scriptural material like the hadith, mm-hmm. which shows a holistic sense of the human, but also some of the later philosophical works like Mullah Sadwa in the Safed period, on whom I work, mm-hmm. and of course Ibn Arabi and some of the other Sufi thinkers who are engaged in metaphysics. And of course we know, with respect to the other kind of body of material which I look at in the piece, which is the sexology manuals, yeah. from around the 14th century, that those texts, of course, on the face of it, are kind of Persian appropriations of Sanskrit texts. Mm-hmm. And in some cases are based perhaps on a vernacular intermediate text from Sanskrit through to Persian. But they are heavily associated with Sufi traditions. So often they are written by prominent Sufis. There are lots of ideas which come in from Sufism about the nature of the body, about the nature of the soul, about the refinement of the person. So, a lot of sexology texts are also about the wider notion of adab, of comportment, of etiquette, and of learned moral values and so forth. So from that, you then start getting a much clearer sense of a holistic approach to the human and the pleasures and pains associated with that.
Right. And you mentioned Sufism. In your introduction, you also mentioned Shia Islam, and you said that you're going to focus on Sufism and Shia Islam in your article. What is the relationship between those 2 things in this article?
It's kind of a shorthand in some ways, because of course I could have looked at a far wider range of hadith kind of and ethical texts. In the end, I looked at the Shia ones because I know those ones a bit better, and they yielded useful material a lot more quickly than some of the Sunni material did. So there are a lot. I mean, there are loads of hadith on sexual pleasure, mm-hmm. On kind of sort of light-hearted behavior on different kinds of pleasure, mm-hmm. In those texts, and they make their way into these kind of akhlaq type, ethics texts in the middle period as well. So, for example, I used the text of Tabrisi on ethics as a good example of that, because there are plenty of texts which talk about pleasure.
Right. I feel like in the Sunni hadith I've seen as well, it's very sort of, I mean, if you're approaching the Middle Ages with the perspective of the Christian Middle Ages, you might be surprised by how sex positive even, well, the Sunni hadith and all medieval Arabic literature feels like. Would you say?
Yeah. It's not just sex positive. I think it's kind of a more positive approach to the body as such.
Right.
So it's much more, so, if you've kind of, being reared on a diet of Peter Brown and all that stuff about the body in Christianity, then this stuff certainly seems a bit odd. But it's perfectly normal. even if you look at classical hadith texts, if you look at much earlier Arabic, sexology manuals and stuff on the pleasures of, the other sensory pleasures, the pleasures of food and wine and so forth, then, those texts are all there. So that's certainly easy to do. So I wasn't necessarily making a, saying that this is something you could arrive at only if you looked at Shia texts and only if you looked at Sufi texts, but you probably could have done others. It's just that I was trying to do things quickly.
Oh, okay. Well, no, you got to narrow it down somehow, don't you?
Exactly.
But I mean, that said about the body positivity, it seems to me, and I'm very much an amateur in the study of Sufism, that there are two apparently opposing strains of world-denying ascetic Sufism and the ones that embrace the body at least as a path to transcendence. Are those two things actually opposed, or am I misunderstanding?
You can consider them to be opposed, but it could also be a matter of degree, right? So, for example, you have the kind of self-purgative, the Malami approach, which was very popular in Arabic and also then later in Turkish and Persian texts in the middle period. And then later you find that even emerging in the South Asian vernaculars through like Qalanda and sort of Malang groups. Who take that even further into different contexts, in which it's all about kind of social transgression through the violation of the body, right?
Right.
So, for example, piercings, shaving off of the hair, just kind of, I don't know, crapping in public and stuff. I mean, just things which are really going to annoy people, and so that you can invite blame, of course, which is the whole point of being a Malami, is you inviting blame, because the body and its attachments to this world are what kind of take you away from God.
Right.
So you have that kind of tendency, which is certainly popular from already around the 11th century. But what I was trying to indicate is that there's some elements of Sufi metaphysics you find in people like Ibn Arabi and his school, which take a slightly different approach, which is that, yes, there is that way of looking at the body, but there's also the way of looking at the body as a proper vehicle, right? So a proper vehicle of perfection. So the disciplining of the body is kind of associated with the disciplining and the purification of the soul, right? And so the pursuit of spiritual pleasures is closely associated with the pursuit of physical pleasures.
Right. And some of these texts you're describing are almost seeming to imagine sexual pleasure as a reflection of the love of God, his creative power, the ecstasy of paradise, sort of here, a little sample of here on this earth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. So you've got, examples of sexual union is associated with, spirit, the mystical union with the divine. So that's often said. You've got lots of kind of metaphors which are used generally. So in the later Central Asian and then in the South Asian tradition, the death commemorations of famous Sufi saints is described as an urs, and of course an urs is a marriage, and so it begs the question of whose marriage, and so the idea there is it's basically the saint and God, right? So those sorts of metaphors are quite clear. In the later vernaculars, you also have this strong sense of in the poetry, so devotional poetry that people write and sing for the saint. I mean, this is something I don't think I discussed in the piece, but there's a whole kind of area of research there. I mean, Scott Kugel's done a bit of work on that, where the poet kind of feminizes himself with respect to the saint.
That's what I was wondering, is who is imagined as the male and female partner.
Exactly. Yeah. So that that happens a lot. It happens not so much in the Persian poetry, but it happens in the vernacular. So in Hindavi, in Braj, in Punjabi, etc., Sindhi, you find that quite commonly in South Asia, in particular, from like the Mughal period onwards.
Right. I mean, the idea of the human as a microcosm is so important, not only in this sort of thinking, but in pretty much all of the medieval world, whether Islamic or Christian. And I've often wondered, how does gender play into that? I mean, does a microcosm entail a balance of male and female and that wholeness as well?
Yeah. So obviously, insofar as the microcosm is also the perfect human, who manifests the totality of the divine names. So you have the sort of dynamic which Sajjad Rizvi wrote about like almost 30 years ago in this book, the Tao of Islam. Actually, more than 30.
Yes, I'm curious about that book.
Yeah. So I think it's from 1989 or 1990. It's one of the first books I read when I was interested in this stuff as an undergrad. So you have this idea of the kind of the names of majesty and the names of beauty. Yeah, the Jamal and the Jalal and Jamal. And so the sense is that the perfect human should also have that kind of balance. Of course, there's a whole other kind of issue of how many exemplars do you have who actually are women in that kind of constellation, and there's not a huge number. There are some famous female saints, but not very many. So it's more kind of a case of how those divine attributes play out in human behavior and exemplification, which then people take on as kind of masculine and feminine traits without necessarily being associated with, I guess, the biology of the person.
Right. I'd like to ask more about the names of God, but first, you mentioned in your article that typically male writers or speakers would gaze at females as a manifestation of the divine. But I mean, of course, that was also done with young men.
Yeah. So in the Persian tradition, that's known as Shahid Bazi. And I mean, that sort of tradition is very prevalent in, from the earliest period all the way up to the modern period. So the idea is gazing upon beauty or consideration of the beloved is beyond the gender of the beloved, right? So and of course in Persian you play with the ambiguity because Persian doesn't use gender. So if you say "oo," or "they" or whatever, then that could be a man, it could be a woman.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter so much, and that's partly because you have this this kind of reflection of kind of the metaphorical and real love sort of dichotomy. So love for another person is merely a kind of a shadow or a metaphor for divine love.
Right. So in that sense, it seems like less of a dichotomy between, say, this earthly life and the afterlife than a shading or into or reflection.
Yeah. It's a matter of degree, I think. I think it's very much a matter of degree. And it's a bit like, the classic, contrast of exoteric and esoteric. I mean, if you don't have the other, one of those notions doesn't really make any sense. So you can't have an exoteric without an esoteric, and vice versa, because it would be meaningless. So in the same way, I think kind of, what's known in Persian as ishq haqiqi and ishq majazi, they wouldn't be meaningful if it wasn't this kind of pair.
I mean, I've spent so much of my time studying books about parties, people drinking wine and flirting at parties. Obviously, a lot of what they do there is very an earthly sort of hedonistic, you might even say sinful type of enjoyment, but it reflects depictions of paradise, doesn't it? Where which are depicted as you have the beautiful clothes and company and food and wine.
Yeah. So I mean, certainly you have this, idea almost of activity in paradise is like this permanent symposium,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I think that's that's certainly the case, and that would have been certainly the sensibility of poets in particular.
Right.
But it's there in the Quran as well. So you have this idea of the serving boys, and you have the hur, and I mean, of course, one assumes that you don't have a kind of radical revisionist reading of what a hur is, but let's assume that we are talking about maidens. And there is stuff about kind of the
Ghulam as well, I think, right?
the hmm?
Ghulam is, or the man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the couches and the silk and the goblets and the flowing rivers and yeah, etc. I mean, all that imagery is already there. All it's already there. Of course, for the philosophers like Avicenna, these were not to be taken too literally. But at the same time, there were plenty of people, including Sufis like Ibn Arabi, saying, well, while that is a fair point to make, it has to be meaningful in and of itself. So it can't just be a metaphor. Language is not either just kind of literal and transparent or merely figurative and metaphorical. So there would have to be a meaningful reason why this would be divine speech to be using such concepts and describing such scenes.
You mentioned Ibn Arabi in your article as saying that sexual pleasure is a, quote, delicious overpowering. And it made me wonder if that links with these images you find in Sufi verse about the intoxication of wine as a method by which to lose yourself sort of in the oneness of creation.
Yeah. So the idea of pleasures generally as intoxication is very common. I think the thing with sexual pleasure which makes it a bit different is precisely, in a sense, it's the ultimate metaphor for unity, right? Or union, in the way that someone eating something or drinking something cannot be like that. So it's kind of the idea of the volitional unity, union of two agents. So I think that's something which is somewhat different.
Is there a sense that this is the...
Are you still there? You seem to have frozen.
You're frozen. I'm not frozen.
Okay. No. Maybe it's my connection. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you're back now. Okay. Oh, I'm back.
I mean, is there a sense that this is... Oh. Hello.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You're back. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll try one more time to ask the question. Is there a sense that this is somehow knowledge to be reserved for the initiated, and that most people should just simply regard, well, the intoxication of wine anyway, as being something that you should avoid in this earthly life? And
yeah, so no, but that doesn't apply, of course, to sex, does it? So
no.
I think it's one of those classic ones where the ethicists and the physicians would talk about moderation and the equilibrium and stuff, and others would say no, it doesn't really matter, it's all about losing yourself. So I think someone like Ibn Arabi is very much on the face of it on the losing yourself side of things. But you have that tension even within Sufism. So, people talk about, from the early period, from the 9th, 10th century, you have this contrast between the sober and the intoxicated Sufis, right? So the idea of the sakar and the what's it called? Maho, is it? I can't remember the terms again. So you have those who are basically kind of like these wild, intoxicated Sufis who go around saying, glory be to me. And the others are like, sitting very quietly in the mosque and, just reciting litanies and whatever. And whereas the other guys are like wandering around the marketplace, like ripping their clothes off and saying, glory be to me, stuff like that. So you get actually both tendencies in someone like Ibn Arabi, but you get the impression the intoxicated one comes out a lot more in some of the writings.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the physicians. I mean, from what I've seen in medical writing, both wine and sexual pleasure have very specific health benefits,
Yeah.
and also possible negative consequences.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that famous myth about, Avicenna basically dying because he had too much sex, which astonishingly a lot of people still seem to believe, and I'm not quite sure why they believe this. But it seems to have been like put about by people who were clearly trying to kind of damage his reputation, because the idea was that if he's like a good physician, he should know better.
Right. Yeah. Which
be misdiagnosing himself like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, in the beginning of your article, you're sort of grounding your discussion in the Greek and Roman precedents. So, I mean, I guess especially the Greek philosophical precedents, which mainly seem pleasure, whether bodily or of the soul, as a means to an end, I'd say, like a means to be a better person in some way, or to transcend to a higher state of being. Does that remain the case for these Sufis, or is the pleasure an end in itself? That it is a little reflection of divine love, or however you want to.
Yeah, but I mean, in a sense, it can't just be an end in itself, because everything is kind of geared towards a recognition of a return to the one, right? So, I mean, in a sense, that's kind of the whole point of the Sufi path, is precisely the recognition that everyone's on this kind of path back to God, regardless of whether you're aware of that or not. And certain experiences kind of just make that more heightened than others. Right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the pursuit of pleasure is not just for itself. That's definitely true.
Just randomly, I want to say I've been listening to the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast a lot, and he's been talking about the early Hermetic corpus, and he noted that in those texts, there often seems to be a bit of a dichotomy between the world hating and the world loving sort of strand. But some people have read that as a stage, that you have to go through the stage of suffering to reach the state. And I'm just wondering if those two branches of Sufism you're describing have anything to do with that.
Yeah, so certainly some people would say that going through the renunciance is a kind of stage. So at the same time, people would say that the intoxication is a stage before you revert to sobriety. So it actually works both ways.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's the whole stuff about the Sufi master kind of having to diagnose what's best for that person, whether it's the intoxication first or whether it's the sobriety first. But certainly in a lot of the kind of more systematic work, so if I think of, again, something like Mullah Sadra, you start with the kind of the introspection and move towards union and intoxication, and then you revert to sobriety in the knowledge that actually there's no difference between sobriety and intoxication.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like the more I study these texts, the more it's about these seemingly irreconcilable opposites reflecting one another and melting into one another, and it's the
Yeah.
coincidental opposites, isn't it?
Yeah, the continental oppositorum, which is
Yeah.
like such a massive kind of theme in medieval thought, regardless of whether it's in Latin or in Arabic or Persian. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. And that's certainly one of the ways in which it would have been understood.
Okay.
Yeah.
That all makes about as much sense as I think we could hope it to. Just so one last question is can you shed any light on the possible Indian or Sanskrit background of any of this thinking?
So for the early period, it's very difficult to know. What's his name? Zaina, the famous Orientalist who was at Oxford many, many years ago, he claimed that what's happening with the early Sufis, whether it's intoxication or sobriety, is very much the influence is coming from the East. So the idea was that, Khorasan was very much an area of a lot of Indian influence, whether that was Buddhist or not Buddhist. So whether it was in Indian terms, whether it was householders or renunciants, so householders are basically what we would call Brahminic Vedic religion, and the renunciants are the Buddhists and the Jains and others. So his suggestion, and there are others who've suggested the same, is that this influence clearly marks the formation of the so-called school of Khorasan, which is very much the intoxication school. The obvious problem you have is that it's very difficult to point to historical evidence for this. A lot of it is, parallels, sometimes calques, sometimes kind of interesting echoes. I mean, one doesn't have to be positivist about it, of course, but there's no clear textual relationship. Of course, when you go a bit later and you start having texts which are produced, which are deliberate acts of translation, whether it's from Sanskrit into Persian or Greek Arabic, Syriac Arabic, etc. There you start to get a sense of how some of those relationships work, and that's where, in the early period, you've got already from the time of Al-Biruni, you have the translation of the yoga texts, and the yoga texts remain a very important element of this. So, yoga is all about, of course, it's a philosophical school, which people often forget, and the spiritual exercises, because that's what most people understand yoga to be, are spiritual exercises which are associated with the philosophical school. Are things which come into Persian and also even Arabic. There are Arabic translations of the yoga texts as well, which are usually done from the Persian later. Those make, some of these relationships, the kind of conceptions of person, of body, of soul, of union, of unity, multiplicity, etc., quite clear that they're talking about the same sort of thing. And so the yoga tradition remains the central one. Later, and this is not surprising because even in the Indic context, the yoga school is always quite closely associated with Vedanta. It's usually Yoga Sankhya, but it's also Yoga Vedanta often come together. So in the Mughal period, you get lots of texts which are produced in Persian, which are either translations or are kind of adaptations in which connections are being made all the time between, these concepts in the Indian schools in Sanskrit and how they relate to concepts in Arabic and Persian.
Are the names of God included in that? Are there any parallels to that?
Yes, there are some examples, and I can't think off the top of my head of them. But that stuff comes up in the, for example, the Yog Vashisht texts, which were produced in the 16th, 17th century at the Mughal court. and we have some examples of this. So like you've got the translations at the end of the 16th century, you've got the translations done around Dawa Shukr, the Mughal prince. You've got the ones which are done slightly earlier by Mir Fendereski, who was this Iranian kind of rather mysterious person who wandered into India quite often. There's an interesting thing about the way he. I thought I had misread the text a long time ago, but actually now I think it's true that they claim that he was actually buried in a kind of an iron coffin because of the power of his alchemical body.
Right.
So he wasn't buried in a normal way in Isfahan. So you've got lots of those sorts of texts. You have other texts which are comparing the traditions. So, for example, I can never remember whether it's Faizi or Abul Fazl, but they were brothers. The court of Akbar. There's this text called Sharik al-Ma'rifat. And Sharik al-Ma'rifat is basically about how Vedant, a bit of yoga, is pretty much the same as Islam. And by Islam, of course, the author there means the school of Ibn Arabi. And then you have lots of other texts. You've got like Abdurrahman Shishti's the text, Mirad al-Haqaiq, which does very similar things. You have, of course, Dawa Shukr's own Majma al-Bahrain, and Majma al-Bahrain is the two Bahars are Vedanta and Sufism. So there are lots of texts which talk about this kind of confluence of ideas and conceptions about the person, about God coming together. One other example I'll give you, it's a text which it's mainly my friend Nizamuddin has been editing it, but I've been kind of helping as well, is I discovered this text ages ago and I was surprised that no one's ever looked at it. It's fascinating. So it's a text called Al-Bawariq al-Nuriya. It's in Arabic from the late 17th, early 18th century. So the earliest manuscript we have is dated 1120. So that's, I think, about 1709 or 8. And he seems to have been an Iranian who then moved to India, and it's a text which is about the unfolding of existence. So it's very much the school of Ibn Arabi. You start with wujud, and then you get the manifestations of wujud and so forth. And the way he does it, because he's also a Shi'i author, is that he constantly draws upon hadith from the Shi'i tradition to exemplify these philosophical positions. And he quotes, Ibn Arabi, he quotes Mullah Sadr, he quotes Sadruddin Qunawi, etc. But one of the other things that he does quite extensively, and I'm trying to actually trace all these citations, is that he has a lot of, he sort of says, okay, so we have this concept and we call it al-wujud al-mahad. And he says, and the Indians call it this. So he has like lists of Indian terms, which are pretty accurate, I guess, vernacular pronunciations of how the Sanskrit terms would have been described. So he's clearly reading these yoga texts, but he's also probably hanging out with people who are having conversations on this.
Interesting.
Because we know a lot of that was happening in the Mughal court.
Right.
And then the last section of that text, which again is very interesting because he also self-describes himself as a Sufi. The final section is on the lataif, so the subtle elements of the body or the soul.
Okay.
And he relates the kind of analysis of the lataif very much as you'd expect to the yoga Vedanta school, to the idea of the chakras and the other kind of subtle elements of the person in the tradition. So yeah, I'm quite excited. We're hoping that will be published sometime next year by the Gibb Trust.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I feel like it's a blank in my own sort of research that I need to fill in as the Indian and Sanskrit influences. Well, behind the magic stuff, I've been.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot more there, which the thing is, there's so many texts, and some of the elements of the magical is kind of not apparent. In some cases there are. So there was this one piece which I was going to write, which I never did do because it was supposed to be from Mesa, and then Mesa went weird. But I was going to write this piece on the Persian poet Bedil, and what he thought of magic and alchemy and stuff, because he has a little poem about this. The interesting thing about the poem is that he's attacking it, right?
Right.
But what I was going to argue in the piece, which I actually hope I will write at some point, is that while he's doing this in this poem, and I suspect he's doing that because he's kind of attacking charlatans, there are lots of elements in his poetry where he clearly understands the alchemy of language and how language works. And he's very much in favor of that kind of approach to language. So he uses certain formulas in kind of, almost talismanic ways. And it's the way in which he uses language, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. But that reminds me, I wanted to ask you about the names of God and their role in this sort of creative act as reflected in sexuality.
Yeah.
Or just in general, I mean.
So, I mean, the question of the divine names is like a massive one. There's so many elements of it, and there are like so many treatises written on it, which is unbelievable. But of course, maybe I should show you that book. I think I might have mentioned this book to you before. It's written in Urdu, and a lot of it is about occult practices, but ones which use divine names. And so, of course, as you know, invocations and talismans made using divine names, or like you write it on a piece of paper and then you wash it off and you drink it and all this sort of stuff. I mean, this is so common. It's everywhere, and it has been for like well over 1,000 years. And some of those actually do relate to things like love potions and what happens if you can't have sex, if you're impotent or stuff like that, or, about conception and all these sorts of things, or so that, your wife loves you or your husband loves you or whatever. So there's a lot of that material, and some of that does use kind of, I guess, what you might call good kind of Quranically based divine names magic. And part of that's the pronouncement of the name, and part of that's the ingestion and the internalization of the name.
Right. Okay. Well, what do you say? Should we possibly wrap this up? Do you have any other last minute points you'd like to add to this discussion before we?
No. At some point, I'd quite like to do something more on the sexology stuff, but I haven't done.
Well, me too. Yeah, I'd like to. And we were talking about humor as well before we started this recording.
Yeah. So I mean, as you know, and I mean, what's her name? Suzanne Kurtz did that. Yeah. She had a lot of these sexology manuals in Persian have a very large kind of medical element to them, and some of them were written as medical treatises as well. Even the versified ones. So the ones I've had a look at, some of which I got from her, are very explicitly medical treatises. Others are not. Others are very much based on this kind of Koka Shastra text that we have. And it's also interesting how some of the text, how some of the poetry works. Because I mean, I'm not great on things like Persian poetry, but my sense is that the poetry is not very good. It's like rather forced.
Yeah.
Like you have to make it rhyme, sort of stuff. Maybe someone might be able to read this more easily, but it's really bad. I mean, some of these like these nazms which were composed, the poetic form of the story is just awful poetry.
Well, maybe it has interesting content though, huh?
Yeah, but I think it's the same story. So you basically with some of these Lazat and Nisa texts, because they usually call Lazat and Nisa, pleasure of women or pleasure from women. Or, it's an interesting thing because it's an
It's
izafa.
the women's pleasure, the women giving pleasure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the kind of the ambiguity of the idafa. But yeah, you have prose versions and you have poetry versions. But it's the same story and it's the same chapter breakdown, etc.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's so many of these texts, I mean, I only like touched on some of them, but like just in the BL, randomly looking for these, I found about 15.
Right.
And I know there were like probably about at least 20 or so at the Ganj Bakhsh library in Islamabad, where I had a look at some of them as well. And that's also where Suzanne got some of hers from. And then some of them also have really bad illustrations. I mean, really kind of like,
good. I want to see
like really cartoonish porn. Really.
Well, now I'm definitely intrigued.
Yeah, I have at least one of those manuscripts. And the illustrations are just really.
Don't set it as your Zoom background or
No, but they're just really bad, very badly drawn.
Well, that sounds lovely. But I mean, I think that the sexology material is very relevant to this type of material because bodily health and spiritual health are, in some sense, one and the same, aren't they? If you're a well-balanced microcosm.
Yeah, and if you have a holistic sense of what it means to be human, then there's no distinction.
Right.
I mean, even in the early period, you had some theologians like Mutakallimin for whom they didn't have a dualistic conception because for them the soul was also somehow material, right? So there was a material continuity between the body and the soul. So there wasn't that kind of distinction.
Oh, you know what? I really wanted to ask you my cleverly worded question. And what is the difference between the soul dwelling in the body and the soul being embodied? Or something? What is the difference between the soul inhabiting a body and a soul being embodied? I feel like that's an important one, actually.
So I think for most people, it's the latter. So I guess a soul inhabiting a body would be the idea that a soul can be free-floating and independent of a body, so pre-existing and post-existing, whereas the soul embodied is very much the coming together of the two. So that's very much the philosophical tradition. For someone like Avicenna, the soul definitely does not exist before the body. And even for some of the later philosophers, even though the body dies, the soul survives by keeping some attachment to some sort of kind of non-material body or some sort of body, some sort of pale imitation or shadow body, whether it's an astral body or whether it's an ethereal body or whatever.
So a soul is only embodied in other ways.
Yeah, a soul can't exist in and of itself.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's probably the majority position.
Okay. I mean, unless it was one with God, or is it? I mean, is that like the sort of Gnostic, the soul?
Yeah, but being at one with God, it's kind of like the famous metaphor in Plotinus, which is also quoted in the Arabic theology of Aristotle. So it says ربما خلقت بنفسي وخلعت بدني and all this sort of stuff. So you kind of doff your body and you ascend to the higher kind of beatific vision of the one. But it's not like you leave your body behind dead. Your body's still there, and it's not a kind of a temporal or physical separation. So it's not as if that body is suddenly devoid of a soul.
I see.
It's probably more kind of an idea of, I mean, not so much in the Arabic, but certainly in some of the Greek debates, you have ideas about parts of souls. I mean, this is not kind of Voldemort kind of parts of souls, but like, you know, that just as you have this notion of the descent of the soul into body. So is this a complete descent or is it a partial descent? And if it's a partial descent, then is the ascent also partial, right? So there's always some element of the soul which remains with the body whilst the body.
So it's like your soul is the column catching up to heaven or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's always an element of the soul which kind of exists up there, like in the presence of the one. But it's a bit more difficult to kind of determine that in the Arabic text because there's no discussion of that sort of question. Whereas, as I said, in the Greek Neoplatonic tradition, there's lots of stuff about partial and complete ascent and descent and stuff like that.
Well, it seems like reincarnation would open up a whole other sort of.
Yeah, I mean, if you basically allow for a soul to be entirely disembodied, right, then you've got a problem.
Right.
Yeah. That does open the door to metempsychosis, yes.
Okay. Okay, well, that was really interesting, I thought. I hope that but it's primarily for my students in Holy Text to Sex Manual, but anyone else.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's see what they make of it.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I've been wanting to talk to you about this article for years, so we finally got a chance to.
Shall I stop recording?
Yeah, I guess stop the recording. Thank you. And I